All right, so I'm Kyle O'Donnell. I work for JSI Aviation Capital. We're kind of new, used to be Shearwater Global Capital. We kind of specialize in asset-based lending on, older aircraft in more unique jurisdictions around the world. So, done a lot of stuff in West Africa, South Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia, and then a handful of things in South America, US, Mexico, Canada, and then Western Europe, obviously. Funnily enough, the first thing that I ever did in business aviation was come to this event. So I am a veteran of the aircraft transaction masterclass. It wasn't here. I actually don't remember where it was, but a lot of very similar speakers. The content's just great. So really, really excited to be here and get the opportunity to give kind of a presentation. How many people in the audience work or have worked in aircraft finance? Okay, it's actually less than I thought, but it seems like everyone I've run into has some kind of connection to it. But I really wanted to build this deck to kind of talk to people with no experience all the way up to, work professionally in the space. So here is kind of the million-foot overview. When you're financing an aircraft, the most important thing for any lender on any asset is risk return. So, are you getting the return associated with the risks, right? I said we finance aircraft in West Africa. Obviously, our returns have to be higher than if you're financing a Fortune 500 company in the US, right? Cost of capital plays into that. That's, what's cost of capital? It's how much it costs to obtain money to lend for the bank or the lender or, whoever. And then the third most important piece is the collateral. We just went through, a whole bunch about pre-purchase inspections. Bring your lender in to the pre-purchase inspections because they will want to see those items and they want to make sure that the asset that they're purchasing is a quality asset and, is going to retain its value going forward. So why does someone need financing on their aircraft, right? A lot of the people and businesses that are purchasing aircraft are exceedingly wealthy, have large piles of cash. If you're buying an airplane, the rule is typically, if you have to ask the price, you can't afford it, right? So why would they come to a bank or a private lender or an equipment financier to, finance their aircraft? And here's just a couple of reasons. The most important reason, and it's always liquidity, right? So whether they have another investment they want to put that money into, whether they need, they need a little bit extra to actually make the purchase happen and they only want to put down a little bit, it's always liquidity. So I talked a little bit about risk return profiles. From a lender's perspective, what you're trying to do is manage risk, right? And the way I think about it is there's three main types of risk that come with lending against an aircraft asset, right? It's who is your borrower and are they going to be able to pay you back? What is the asset and how confident are you in the valuation of said asset? And then, where is it going to be? It's kind of a unique issue that you run into with aircraft is that they can fly virtually anywhere in the world. So important pieces of this, right? If you're looking into your borrower, what kind of things do you want to know about them, right? You want to make sure that they have the credit to pay you back, right? I think later in this session, people will be talking about like guarantees, whether personal or corporate. That plays a big part in what your risks look like as a lender, right? If you have a business that's willing to give a corporate guarantee on the aircraft and they're a, well-funded business, you're not going to run into an inability for them to pay you back if they default on this aircraft, right? You can come after them in the courts, you can take your time, and you'll be made whole. You want to make sure that the people you are lending to are not criminals or have kind of shady pasts, right? And then obviously guarantees. I think someone is talking about guarantees in more detail later on in the conference. The asset protection and valuation is what I put in here. So once you lend on the aircraft, you're anticipating that it's going to be used for something, right? To fly someone somewhere, to do charter. If all is going well, the airplane is flying. So important things to make sure that you have control of, or at least knowledge of, is who is managing the aircraft, who's in charge of doing the maintenance, who is supplying the pilots. One of the issues that we run into a lot is, and because we're primarily an asset-based lender, we don't do credit checks on our borrowers, right? So we have to make sure that the asset valuation is good and solid, and that we're only lending to a point where if we do have to take the airplane back, we can sell it and come out whole regardless of market fluctuations, right? It's a different animal post-COVID now when values have gone up 15, 20% in some cases, to try to make sure that your residual values, and I know Assad is going to talk about residual values tomorrow, but that's another important piece of financing. The last one is jurisdictional risks, right? So where in the world is this aircraft going to be based? There's been some talks about where the governing law is, and each kind of jurisdiction has its own quirks, different items. What are the foreclosure laws? How long does it take you to actually go through the repossession process in certain structures? Are there any sanctions associated with those jurisdictions right now, post Russia invading Ukraine? You have to make sure that every level of this is not, there is no, aircraft hasn't been to Russia in the last 5 or so years. And then obviously the Cape Town Convention. I don't know if anyone's actually talked about it, but I am not as qualified as others in the crowd here to talk about Cape Town. So here are the really key components, and I would say that this is, if you are involved in, or I guess if you are involved in the purchase of an aircraft and your client is going with a financier and they send you a term sheet, these are the components in the term sheet right here. So obviously there's the key piece here, which is the asset, right? How old is it? What type is it? Are they going to put it on Part 135 or Part 91 equivalent, depending on where it's registered, where it's based? Same piece about the borrower, whether it's a credit lending or it's asset lending. You have to know who they are, where they come from, do your KYC. Where is the aircraft going to be registered and what jurisdiction is it going to be under? We typically do New York law. And then we are pretty open to a good chunk of registrations. Next one is the title of the aircraft, and I think they're talking about it in the next section, about how you structure an aircraft financing, but I think it's also the next page of mine. Who are the managers? Who does the maintenance? How long is the term, right? So I guess we'll jump to balloon too. Does anybody know what a balloon payment is in a loan that isn't in finance?
Lump sum.
Yeah, lump sum. So at the end of the term, there will be an amount that is still due that you have to pay, right? And you can use that balloon payment to kind of artificially extend the loan terms. So if you do, I think if you do a 5-year term with an 80% balloon, it works out to a 20-year amortization. And a lot of times you'll see financiers quote, 20-year amortizations, but that doesn't mean that you're getting a loan for 20 years. It means you're getting a loan for some period of time as though it was paying down for 20 years.
It's to reduce the monthly payment.
Exactly. But it also creates a little bit of risk for the lenders, right? Because you're not paying the loan down as fast. So if you have a much older asset, right? Let's say you're financing a 15 to 20-year-old aircraft, you get towards the end of the term and you've only paid down 1 year of depreciation, you're going to be in a position where you could be underwater.
But it depends on the loan to value.
That's correct. So typically, if it's higher, you would want to amortize the loan faster. You want to watch out for closing costs, right? Most lenders are going to charge a closing or an origination or a setup fee, typically as a percentage of the purchase price. And you just want to, especially if you're a broker, make your clients aware that that's coming, because it's another piece of the pie that is going to have to get sorted out. And then guarantees, I think this is the third time I've talked about guarantees already, but it is an important piece, right? It is a factor that we typically don't require it. We typically just do I think it's called a triggering guarantee, where if a borrower materially misrepresents themselves or essentially lies, then we have the recourse to go after them for repayment. But if they just stop paying us, we can't go after them to try to get repayment. These are important because it could leave your client kind of on the hook, right? Legal action could be taken against them by the lender to try to get payments back. Here are some structures. I'm not going to say it's all of the structures, but typically with lending, you have these two at the front. So the big ones are, loans and leases. And so with a loan, the borrower owns the aircraft. With a lease, the lessor owns the aircraft. And so you've seen, at least in business jets, the operating leases have kind of declined, especially in the US, because people want to take advantage of bonus depreciation as the owner of the aircraft. Traditional loans have stayed reasonably steady. I think, I was looking at the data a few months or so ago. In the US, there is a noticeable decline in transactions that are financed, and with leases being basically eliminated over the past, 7 years, basically since 2017. The finance lease, I'm sure, who's next? Was it Eddie? Eddie's next. I'm sure it will be talked about in much greater detail in the next piece, but a finance lease is kind of a combination of a traditional loan and an operating lease. It's I guess I would describe it as a lease-to-own structure. So you essentially lease the aircraft, but in the documents, it's saying that title will transfer at the end of the loan period. So it works like a loan, but it's in a lot, and it depends on different jurisdictions, right? So in the U.S., you can't use a finance lease, and I'm sure they'll get into this. You can't use a finance lease because the regulators look at the the function as opposed to the form. So in a lot of other jurisdictions, you can say this is a lease and the regulators will believe you. In the US, they will not, and they will view this as a loan. And I think it has something to do with the assigning a purchase price at the end to pay off the loan. Progress payment financing, sometimes called pre-delivery payment financing. You familiar with that? No? So when you purchase a new aircraft from an OEM, they will require deposits, right, to build your aircraft, and typically it comes in the form of what they call progress payments. And so at the time of signing the document, there's you owe 30%, and then 6 months later you owe another 15%, and then 30% until you get to the 100%. And when you're buying a $72 million airplane, that kind of clogs up your liquidity, right? Especially if you're going to use financing when the aircraft delivers. So you're essentially putting down the entire amount as you go to purchase, and then maybe 30% at the very end you would finance out, and then you would have a 5 to 10 year term. With pre-delivery payment financing, you can finance those progress payments, and you make monthly payments as the amount increases, and it just helps with liquidity. I think they're somewhat common. The short term makes lenders not love them because a lot of times it's a year and a half, and then you get paid back in full as they take delivery of the aircraft. But if you can combo that with a term financing on the end, you can have money out to a borrower for 7, 8 years and have pretty minimal risk. Bridge loans, kind of like progress payment financings, they're just short loans, right? So someone has an event where, I need to pull money out really quickly. They'll go looking out for a bridge loan, or if they're going to a bank and they can get bank financing, it can take a little while to get through credit checks. And sometimes you just want to make the aircraft purchase quickly and then refinance that out. And lines of credit, a lot of business jet brokers have the bigger ones have warehousing facilities so that they can buy inventory and then sell it at a later date for a profit. A line of credit lets them do that. So this is the absolute simplest landscape that I could put together. So essentially what you have is low rates, great credit, all the way down to high rates, minimal credit. And it goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning, where the kind of niche for financiers is risk return. So for the big commercial banks, they want the best credits. They want to be the most assured. They're going to require, guarantees. They're going to want that whole suite of protections. And in exchange for that, they're going to give you the best rate possible, right? Airplane loans, especially in the US, are surprisingly cheap, in my opinion, in terms of interest rates. You see the regional banks, the institutionally backed lenders. In the US, most business jets, as far as my understanding goes, most business jets are financed by regional banks, right? You have a local guy who owns a business who's looking to buy an airplane, and he already has a relationship with his local regional bank. And so they will bend over backwards trying to get financing just to maintain the relationship. They're not aircraft financing experts, but they like doing those deals just to keep the clients, coming in, calling, making payments, keeping their money with the bank. Same thing, right? Good credit, typically good credit. I think they would do it on sort of medium credits too, but and then they'll give rates that are kind of similar to the commercial banks. Equipment leasing companies, they're kind of, once you get to C and D on here, you're kind of looking at the non-traditional lenders. So much less regulated, willing to do more risky deals, but they're seeking those higher returns. And then the private finance companies at the end, which are, could be hedge funds, could be, private debt funds, those kinds of things where you're going to see high rates, but you're also not going to see guarantees. You're not going to see credit checks. You're going to see kind of less quality assets. So here's kind of the lay of the land, or a couple of points, I guess, on global business jet financing. The US represents 63%. I think that number is a couple months old, but the US represents the vast majority of business jets in the world. And so everything kind of skews heavily towards the US. Outside of the US, you see, less competition for financing, and you see less bank willingness, right? So US, Western Europe, Canada, the banks, I think, typically like to do business jets there. There's lots of wealth, there's lots of security. You can kind of keep a reasonable tab on what the aircraft is doing. Once you get outside of those areas, it becomes a lot harder to do those things. And you see, as a result, I think, outside of that area, you see a lot of private wealth banks playing a larger role, right, for the same reasons that commercial banks in the US are playing kind of an outsized role there. If I am a Nigerian who runs an oil company and I have $170 million with my private bank, they're going to be interested in providing you a loan on your aircraft just to keep the money with them, right? So you see a lot of plays to keep aircraft with, or do aircraft financing through institutions that you're already interacting with, as kind of a courtesy. And those rates are typically comparable to, maybe a little higher than, a commercial bank. You run into, every jurisdiction is different, and it really is. We did I'm sure somebody in here works on, in Austria, right? Anybody in Austria? So what do you have to do to secure your lien on an airplane in Austria? Can you? Sorry? So in order to secure your lien, you have to.
An Austrian pledge.
You have to have.
A piece of paperwork recorded in the.
Yeah.
In the paper file.
You put a plaque on each of the engines and the airframe that says, my business owns this airplane, and that happens at closing, right? There's different quirks kind of everywhere in the world. I don't know if this is still the case, but a few years ago, apparently you can have one aircraft on multiple AOCs in South Africa. But you kind of have to, you have to get advice locally. You have to have someone you trust to be able to kind of help you navigate those places. And the last one makes sense. How am I doing on time? Pretty good. All right. Why do lenders get in or out of business jet financing? We've kind of talked a little bit about this. Economic outlook, geopolitical risks, interest rates, tax policy,
Burnt fingers.
Huh? Yeah. So, economy's doing well, people are paying, it might be worth it to get in, right? You want to think about kind of competing assets for lenders, right? So maybe financing construction equipment is a better play than financing business jets. When the war in Ukraine kicked off, a lot of people don't want to lend on jets, right? You had a lot of lenders who got really hurt lending on Russian airplanes. And so now the calculus is very different. Changing interest rate environments, it can, I think most lenders are kind of agnostic because everyone is kind of affected by whether interest rates are going up or going down. But selling financing can become more difficult. Yeah, go ahead.
What do you think are the most exciting markets for your business right now?
Exciting markets.
Sporty financing, that's what you guys do, right?
Sorry?
I call it sporty financing.
Sporty.
You're looking for the higher risk areas.
I mean, where we've seen the most action, a lot in West Africa, a lot in Southeast Asia. Malaysia, Indonesia specifically. I don't know, I'm not sure that, the correlation to financing goes with economic outlook, right? So what you may see is 2 or 3 years ago, a country was doing really well economically, and as it starts to kind of pull back, people need financing now. So, we've seen a little bit of an uptick in those areas where we're, doing a lot of deals, seeing a lot of deals come through. And it's kind of hard to pinpoint why, honestly. So rates theoretically should be coming down. Obviously, they've come down a little bit in the past month, couple weeks. Tax policy can really drive how people structure their deals. We had a deal recently where we were closing in Florida, but the sale wasn't happening with a Florida registered dealer. And so we couldn't get flyaway exemption. So we had to structure it as a back-to-back to get it out, or to close on the deal. But you see it in trends in operating leases versus loans. You see it in, how lenders tend to structure their financings. The aging fleet. So in the lead up to the financial crisis, there were a lot of aircraft made, right? There weren't that many aircraft, business jets, I guess, floating around from, in the 90s and the very, very early 2000s. And so what you're seeing now is the kind of spread of how old aircraft are is shifting to older, right? Because there's that, I can't remember the exact number. It's something like 3,000 airplanes over normal during 2004 to 2007. And now you've seen those aircraft kind of push to 15, 20 years old. And so it's hard to lend against an aircraft that's, 15 or 20 years old, right? Because you have to figure out what the residual values are. You have to ensure that if for some reason as the lender you get that aircraft back, you have to be able to sell it, right? So it's much easier to do on a 5-year-old aircraft than it is on a 20-year-old aircraft or older.
Do you guys consider the older aircraft with the objective that you can basically give it to Brendan?
Well, it definitely plays in. It's kind of a unique feature of JSSI Aviation Capital is that we do have the ability with an in-house kind of part-out team.
Expects me final crack.
Yeah.
But is that what the balloon is then?
There was an element, when it was all launched, there was a strategy. That was part of the strategy as I understood it. But
Yeah.
whether it's still in place, and we haven't seen anything come to fruition yet because it takes a few years.
Exactly.
It's, yeah.
Well, and you need borrowers to default, which we really haven't been seeing. But yes, that is a little bit of the strategy behind it. I think the oldest aircraft I've personally financed was a 1981 Falcon 50.
But wouldn't you be able to do RPGs then, residual guarantees?
I think it's a challenging proposition. We could theoretically do one internally, but I don't know if we would be able to publish that to anyone.
Probably have with RPGs, and I know Stan's going to.
I was going to say we can do one.
They form
You
a
want?
contingent liability on your balance sheet as a bigger group trading doing something else.
Yeah.
And that causes a massive problem with finances. So,
Okay.
unless you're in that business, and I'm going to default to sad. But it's not an easy way to make a living.
No, it's not. It is not. All right, and then obviously competition for capital from other asset classes. That's kind of makes sense, right? So, how do commercial aircraft fit into this? They're really different. One of them is a time machine, and the other one is a revenue generation tool. You run into, with business jets, your typical borrower could be in any number of industries, pretty well spread across the globe. When you're lending against commercial aircraft, your borrower has one business, and it seems to be pretty cyclical. Every 5 to 10 years, there's some kind of event that causes, commercial aircraft to shut down or, not be very profitable. The scale is really different. There are a lot of commercial aircraft flying around, and there are, 15,000 business jets? 20, yeah, depending on how you classify on the low end. Obviously demand, it's been said a couple times, business jets are a luxury item, whereas commercial aircraft are, you're never not going to have demand for someone to be able to get to another part of the world, right? Without commercial aviation, I wouldn't be here because, I can't afford the luxury of a business jet just yet. And so what you end up seeing in the commercial aviation space is a lot of leasing. The operators don't want to have those aircraft on their books, and so you have leasing companies that come in that buy up a lot of commercial aircraft and then lease them to, the top tier operators first. Then when they come back in 5 to 10 years, they lease them to the second tier operators, and that cycle kind of continues. Whereas in business jets, you see a lot of loans, you see a lot of, different types of structures because the scale is so small and it's typically a single transaction. All right, so I think this is my last slide. So I kind of wanted to get in, I talk to people all day about financing their aircraft. It's hard to see it when you do it all day, what the perspectives of other people are on your product, right? So, if you're an aircraft broker, what do you need to know about financing? I tried to be as thorough as I could. But really what you're trying to do is you need to have an understanding of how the terms work. Closing fees, advance rates, get a copy of the term sheet, go through it. You can almost always just enter in the terms into an online financial calculator, and it will spit out an amortization schedule for you to look at to kind of go through with your client. Or you can send a note directly to the financier and say, I'm trying to figure out how this works. Help me advise my client on what's going on with the deposits, what's going on, with each of these pieces. At least for my business, aircraft managers, we view them, as really, really good partners. If a borrower is behind, we ask the aircraft managers every month to send us, a statement of account that basically proves that they're being paid, right? Because I think the aircraft manager is in a really, really difficult position when it comes to kind of managing the push and pull between financier and, borrower, I guess owner of aircraft. And so if there is a point where you're starting to get a little nervous, they've burned through their deposit, they're now 2-3 months past, call up your financier and tell them that that's happening, and we can put pressure on, the owner borrower to make sure that the managers are paid, right? Because if there is a repossession scenario and they stop paying the borrower or the lessor, then the money to pay the aircraft manager has to come out of the sale of the aircraft, but the manager is going to be on the second tier of that, right, in the waterfall. The lender is going to get paid back first, then the aircraft manager. So it puts you in a really awkward position. So if you can identify that early and start pressing, the lender should be in a position where they can kind of, push. I don't think that anyone would send a, default notice on, a month or two late on management fees, but you can start to kind of nudge the client to start making payments. Tax, talked about it a couple times, implications of structure and function, use the financier to kind of set this up in a way that gives your client the best, tax outcome. We've run into things where, structuring a deal as a finance lease versus a loan incurs a, 30% tax, right? And so looking at this, it's important to, as with every stage of an aircraft transaction, figure out what the implications for tax are, figure out where the closing location is going to be, and then, try to structure the financing to fit. For insurance, obviously, any lender is going to have requirements for having the aircraft on insurance, how the sole loss payee clause is put in there. And I think it's just, as an insurance person, you should be kind of proactively seeking the financier and making sure that as you put that, insurance together, that you have the right terms and that it's not going to have to go back and forth 8 times. And that is all I have. Nice. 5 minutes under. Does anyone have any questions?
Do you run tri-party agreements with the management company?
Yes.
So you can get easy repossession of the asset?
Yeah, so, I mean, from our position, the asset is the only recourse that we have. So all of our deals are structured really aggressively to make sure that we have access to the asset, we have access to the logs. We struggle to do, any sort of owner-operator structures. We'll have a tripartite agreement, and we really only use aircraft managers that have some amount of scale, because you run into, if you're in a position where you're an aircraft manager that has 2 airplanes and the financier comes to repossess one of them, you're losing half of your revenue. And so, yeah, you're legally inclined to follow the direction of, the owner of the aircraft and with the tripartite agreement, but you're not going to make it easy, right? Anyone else?
Anything else you look into a management company?
Anything else that we're looking for in a management company? I think for us, there is it's kind of almost like a Goldilocks zone, right? It needs to be someone that, we have contact with, that we can call them up and they can make things happen. Because in a repossession scenario, things happen really quickly. We like, what is it? It's, Argus and Wyvern, I think. Some of those make it an easier sell, right? There's a whole committee that needs to get passed through to make an aircraft manager kind of approved within our system, and it's not like a formal list, but I typically like to see something over 20 aircraft, and then beyond that, it doesn't really matter where in the world you are.
Do you finance operators?
It can become challenging. We could do it, well, we'll finance operators in the US. I don't know if I don't think I did talk about it, but in the US, you can just go take the airplane, right? So we've done a few operators in the US, but outside of the US, it just becomes much more difficult because,
Why?
well, because the US has self-help laws, right? Lawyers, help me out.
We do here as well.
We do here.
Oh, do we?
Yeah.
Oh,
But
Well-
it's the minority of jurisdictions that have it,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So the US is part of the alphabet. But here you go.
Yeah, you're going next.
In France, you have to get the local mayor to sign off for them.
But yeah, typically we'll do operators in the US. It just becomes a challenge to do it outside of the US just because.
Well, the reason I
How
ask
do you
is
get
because
here?
there's a lot of owners now, because of the Green Army, looking to shift away from ownership things.
Okay.
One of the obvious ideas would be you finance
Yeah,
the
that's it.
operator, they take the ownership.
Yeah.
It's one of the main principles of operating is to mitigating the ownership structure.
Yeah.
Yeah.